Welcome to War Room Pandemic. This is a special edition. We started yesterday. These are 1 hour special broadcasts focused on one topic. We started this. This is about the Chinese Communist Party's war against America. We started yesterday with Professor Dr. Edward Luttwak, the great author and thinker, top geopolitical thinker around, I believe, author of Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. His book on geopolitics is required reading at the Army War College, Naval War College at Georgetown, where I get my master's degree in national security studies. A great thinker. This week, for the next 5 days in a row, we're going to actually lean on the Committee on the Present Danger, China. This is a reconstitution of the Committee on the Present Danger that was the backbone of really the Reagan Revolution in looking at how to take on the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, and eventually led to its demise. I'm joined here by Jack Maxey in studio. Jack is an old anti-communist war fighter for many, many, many decades as a young man, and for all of us that came out of this is the OK Boomer, the guys that came out of the Cold War. Right, this is this Chinese Communist Party. Remember, it's not really an ideology of communism. It's really gangsters. Same type of gangsters are in Moscow, same type of gangsters that the Nazis had in Berlin, the same type of gangsters that Mussolini and these guys had in Rome. They're all gangsters, right? Just pure gangsters. And we're going to be joined today in today's session to kind of kick it off and give an overall framework for what we're going to be seeing the rest of the week. We're going to go through in the rest of the week unrestricted warfare. We're going to have a whole special hour just to kind of go through what unrestricted warfare actually says, which is the master plan of the Chinese military, PLA, in the Communist Party. We're also going to talk about economic warfare. We're going to talk about how they use the capital markets, these currency wars, and we're going to end up talking about their military strength, essentially a military that's paid for by taxpayers of the United States. What do I mean by that? The over $1 trillion that we have borrowed from them, the interest rates alone that we pay, guess what? Fund the complete Chinese military, just so make sure that you understand and you enjoy tonight in the comfort of your home, your sons and daughters that are on patrol in the South China Sea or at the 38th parallel up in Korea. Remember, the enemy is financed by the taxpayers of the United States of America. I want to bring in now Brian Kennedy, who formerly a president, head of Claremont, one of the top strategic thinkers around. Brian, how'd you get hooked up in this mess? You were one of the guys who came up with the idea of reformulating and standing back up the old Committee on the Present Danger to kind of alert. We did this a couple of years ago to alert America, the political class, the elites of what was going on here. How did you come up with the idea? Why did you think it was important that we had to kind of, a couple of years ago, start getting in people's faces about what this problem was with the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, Steve, thank you, first of all, for doing all this. And I think it was conversations I was having with you and Frank Gaffney, primarily, that we were talking about how to help President Trump and President Trump's agenda to combat what we saw as an information war by the PRC. And the PRC, as you have been describing these many months, they are gangsters, sure, but they're also very sophisticated. They have spread a lot of money around American universities, the American media, and they know how to manage information. And so we thought the Committee on the Present Danger China would be an effort to explain to Americans just what the real threat was, knowing that every force arrayed against President Trump was really going to either misinform, disinform, and try to oppose in almost any way they could the agenda that the president had. And we're doing this not to support President Trump as President Trump, but because President Trump has actually stood for standing up to communist China and being the kind of president who understood what was really at stake in our war with them.
Let's talk about this for a second. President Obama, very early on, he said pivot to Asia. We've got to get out of this CENTCOM mentality. We've been bogged down. Remember, he ran as an anti-war populist. He was one of the few guys in the Senate that voted against it. He ran on that. He browbeat Hillary Clinton in the primaries. I think the principal reason he won the Democratic primary, he ran as the anti-war candidate. when he came in, he addressed immediately, we need to pivot to Asia. Now, he deputized Joe Biden to it. I don't want to politicize this by that, but he saw the problem. Why do you think he failed? And I think he would admit it was a failure to get a whole of government approach to actually address this situation with the Chinese Communist Party. Why do he must have understood in his mind something was wrong, but he couldn't move the government. Why do you think that?
Well, the pivot to Asia may have been more, let's go start raising money in Asia. And so he sent Joe Biden there. And again, I say that like you, not in a partisan way, but what was the pivot to Asia all about? Did they do the kind of things militarily to make us stronger? I mean, he opposed missile defense, which would have made us stronger vis-a-vis communist China. He dismantled in so many ways big parts of the American military. He continued the transfer of technology to China by American industries and using the American government to transfer all sorts of scientific discoveries to China. That all occurred under President Obama. What did he do to hold China to account? The theft of intellectual property, if anything, accelerated under Obama, with precious little being done to stop that. And if President Trump got elected for any reason, is that he made the case to the American people that just has to stop. And so I don't see the pivot to Asia as anything more than something of a fraud. It was a rhetorical device, I think, to try to get us out of the Middle East, or to focus less on the Middle East, which had been a disaster, and to focus instead on, superpower relations with the PRC.
When you say it's been a disaster, and this even goes back to some of the Bush administration, American foreign policy, national security policy, and kind of economic policy since the turn of the century, and we had Lee Smith on in the regular show talking about, he's done articles now in Feinstein, in Most Favored Nations, Feinstein in the World Trade Organization. But as a great power, we don't have a terrific track record at the beginning of the 21st century. When you look at allowing China to get Most Favored Nation status, WTO status, to basically give them a free pass, to essentially deindustrialize America, coupled at the same time exposure to the 9/11 attacks and then the wars in the Middle East afterwards, and this rise of China, which kind of the CIA and nobody focused on. It's a pretty pathetic track record when you look at it, isn't it?
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, how is it that we focus on the Middle East the way we do, completely ignoring the technological advances by the PRC and their ongoing development of both a first world military to challenge ours, but also their persistent penetration of American society. During those Obama years, but really, all this century, as you say, the Chinese have gotten just very, very good at the development of their Confucius Institutes here in the United States, the sponsorship and the spreading around of spending of billions of dollars, supporting scholars in American universities, writers, thinkers, etc., to adopt the PRC's rhetorical and political and economic line for why they're a rising power, why we ought to work together, why we ought to integrate our two economies, and really to lull American strategists and policymakers into thinking this is just one more trading partner that we have problems with because they're communists, but that this is not some grand strategic threat. And I think the real modification now is, can we think of them as a strategic threat?
Look, you ran one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, conservative, I don't know, think tank, but thought leader. And the Claremont Review is the New York Review of Books for conservatives. We're trying to coach people up here. Explain what Confucius Institute is. We got about 3 or 4 minutes. Walk through in details how they've used Confucius Institutes, how they've used the universities, and how they've tried to influence thought leaders to really say, oh, it's a win-win. We should have a strategic dialogue with China, but they're our partners.
Yeah, that's a great question. Even though we have a country that is built on popular opinion is still more or less dominated by elite opinion. If there's someone on television or in front of a congressional hearing, typically they're a professor at a university, a PhD in this or that, and they're talking to either congressmen or senators or the elite media with the authority that they know more than everybody else. And so the Chinese understanding that, the Chinese figured out how to hire those people to promote the Chinese point of view. And so Americans are very influenced by what goes on in American universities. So they started in over 100 campuses across the country, these Confucius Institutes, where under the guise of simply teaching the Chinese language and Chinese culture, they slowly, by putting those kinds of funds in those kind of universities, they're slowly able to shape what goes on in those universities. They're able to stop speakers from speaking on campus who might be anti-communist. Any criticism of the PRC is stopped immediately. And again, the PRC knew, the Chinese Communist Party knew, that if you could shape those individual people and how they thought of China, that would reverberate all through American popular opinion. Even though the facts were quite the opposite, that we were losing jobs, we were seeing all sorts of Chinese bad behavior, we were seeing the ongoing theft of our intellectual property. Even though we saw all that, there was this calming effect that all these voices on university campuses gave to both, the news media, but also to Congress more broadly. Where in Congress in the last decade has there been experts talking about either the military, political, or economic threat of the PRC? It really is only very recently that that's occurred. And again, one of the goals of the committee has been to get these folks together in a group so that their voice could be magnified and American policymakers could understand the magnitude of the threat. Because even though you call them gangsters has a certain accidental quality to it, that they're just evil. The Chinese Communist Party is very sophisticated. It is able to control a country of 1.4 billion people and do so in a very precise way, in a very ruthless way, with a intelligence service that knows exactly what to do, a police state that knows how to stop any kind of dissent. And I think we underestimate them, because it's not like they're just gangsters. These are gangsters who are much more sophisticated than anybody we ever saw in the Soviet Union.
Brian, I'm going to take a commercial break. We're going to go with Frank Gaffney next to talk about the Cold War. But when you come back for your next segment, I do want to start off with one item, and that's this Confucius Institute, in that people are now awakening to this crisis. And one of the things they're doing, they're understanding the fifth column that's actually here in the United States. Universities, others are starting to fight back and say, hey, the study of Chinese language, the study of Chinese culture, I love, but that's not what these things are. These things are fifth columnists here to come in and actually spread the ideas of the Chinese Communist Party. Brian Kennedy is going to return. He's the co-founder and chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. He's going to join us in a couple of segments. We're going to go next, take a short commercial break, go next to Frank Gaffney and Jack Maxey talking about the Cold War and what it means for us today as a lesson learned, in a moment on War Room Pandemic.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back. This is a special edition, a special broadcast of War Room Pandemic. We are doing, yesterday we started with Professor Luttwak on the geopolitics of the CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party's war against America. For this entire week, for 1 hour a day, we're going to be doing specials with the Committee on the Present Danger, China. And this is a group of patriots that have come together to really warn America about the risk of being in business with and not confronting the Chinese Communist Party. It's a reformulation of something that took place back in the Cold War that was one of the foundational elements of President Ronald Reagan's his attack in war, in destruction of the evil empire of the Soviet Union. We're going to be joined momentarily by Frank Gaffney, the co-founder of the Committee on the Present Danger, an old Cold Warrior from the Reagan administration. But Jack, you come at this from even your youth about being you're one of the Republicans, that three-legged stool of the Republican Party. You're that leg that's one of the you were a hardcore anti-communist warrior.
Well, I came out of this from my family. My father's side of the family all were in service. My grandmother was one of the original members of the OSS. Her brother was an admiral in World War II, and her brother-in-law was a fighter of communists in the FBI. And then I had the wonderful experience of growing up with a wonderful man named Frank Piasecki, who was a great American inventor, but also a great leader of the anti-communist movement, particularly for refugees coming from Eastern Europe. And after the Second World War, the Ukrainian and Polish governments in exile were actually moved to Philadelphia. So as a young man, I had so many wonderful experiences listening to the first-hand horrors of totalitarian regimes. So from a young age, I've always had a great empathy for the people suffering under it, because so many of the people I admired in my youth had suffered under these systems. And so being part of this, I've said it to Steve several times, is really a highlight of my life to be able to be part of this mission.
As we take it now to the Chinese Communist Party, Frank Gaffney now joins us. Frank is the chairman emeritus of the Center for Security Policy, which he stood up many, many years ago, and is now the co-founder of this new rejuvenated Committee on the Present Danger. This is Committee on the Present Danger China. Frank, you're a Cold Warrior from many, many decades ago. In fact, you were in the Reagan administration taking on the evil empire. Can you talk to us about what the original Committee on the Present Danger, or at least the second version that was in the 1970s, why was it important, and why are there certain analogies between now and then?
Steve, I want to say, first of all, thank you for your leadership in encouraging the creation of this group. I'm very pleased with my colleague Brian Kennedy, who I think we'll be hearing from too, to have had a hand in re-kick-starting, if you will, this sort of pickup team of people who, back in the 1970s, as you say, came together in the form of a Committee on the Present Danger Committee on the Present Danger, to assist Ronald Reagan in thinking about an alternative to the kind of engagement, if you will, of the day. Détente was the title of it, with the Soviet Union that had been practiced by Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan was running for the presidency of the United States to offer an alternative that was not essentially going to do what that engagement program entailed, which was to prop up the Soviet Union, to perpetuate that communist evil empire, as you said, and instead would offer, called it peace through strength. In practice, it turned out to be a strategy for taking down that evil empire, that Soviet communist system. And it's very, I believe, appropriate to think about it today and to have a similar group of people, national security practitioners, subject matter experts, business leaders, human rights and religious freedom activists, coming together, as was done in the 70s, to offer an alternative vision and a strategy for accomplishing it. And that's why this Committee on the Present Danger China is, I think, both timely, needed, and hopefully making a real contribution by pointing out it doesn't have to be more of the same. It doesn't have to be more of our transferring to China, our manufacturing capabilities and propping them up with our financing from Wall Street or through political legitimization. We can have a strategy that disengages and ultimately creates the conditions for liberating the people of China from the Communist Party that, represses them and threatens us.
Let's go back. I want to go back because you talk about consensus. The consensus back then, I mean, Reagan was looked at, to be brutally frank, as a nut job, right? Henry Kissinger, and this is all outlined in Peter Schweitzer's...
Amiable dunce, I think.
No. Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. Henry Kissinger referred to him as the most dangerous man in America. This is all outlined in Peter Schweitzer's terrific book, Reagan's War, of which I adapted into my first film I ever wrote and directed, documentary, I think a 2-hour documentary called In the Face of Evil. And it was really about Reagan's 50-year, 70-year, journey from a Roosevelt Democrat to really the guy who said, hey, we win, they lose. But at the time, and this is what I want to make sure people understand today, if you think there's a consensus out there that, hey, the CCP's fine, we got to be in business with them, it was much worse in the 70s. This was, people forget, Kissinger was in the Republican administration. He was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the same time. Take us back to the 70s when the business community, the academic community, both political parties were all about détente. They were about SALT treaties. They were about rapprochement. This was all, hey, this is what you guys were up against, was this uniformity, right? Of thought of that the Soviet Union was fine. We just had to deal with it.
It was basically the same thing we're up against now, Steve. It was the elite telling us that either if we simply enriched the Soviet Union, they would become a responsible member of the international community, or in the case of Henry Kissinger, and I want to thank you for another real service you've rendered recently, which was calling him out as the shill that he was for the Soviets back in the day and now for the Chinese communists. But the thought at the time was, for Kissinger particularly, we've lost the Cold War. We just need to basically try to get the best terms we can. And if that's arms control that disarms us, if it's giving them credits or giving them most favored nation status or giving them basically anything else they wanted, it was just part of having to essentially pay the victors. A similar kind of mindset is clearly operating today.
But hang on for a second.
Kind of globalist.
Hang on a second. I may have to keep you over for the next, and then we'll bring Brian in. But this is so essential to drill down on. Why did Henry Kissinger? What was he looking at in the 60s and early 70s that he came? This is the beginning of the Thucydides trap, because they would always go back to the Peloponnesian War, ancient Athens and Sparta. What was it that Kissinger saw at the time that you said, hey, we'd already lost this, we're just trying to get the best surrender terms?
Well, I don't know whether he actually embraced the communist ideology. I don't think there's any evidence of that, but he certainly thought it was the rising tide, and America was finished for all intents and purposes. We just needed to try to figure out what the best terms we could get, as I said, are. And in that spirit, he basically, I think, was anticipating that, well, he would profit from it as well, as indeed he has. But at this notion that in order to avoid a horrific war, a thermonuclear war, we had to basically accept that the Soviets were going to be dominant. They would have more nuclear weapons than we would in the SALT treaty, for example. Their economy, we were told, was going to be dominant. They would bury us. We essentially were finished. And for Kissinger, I think, as he saw fit to do again and again and again. I mean, he did it with the Vietnamese communists, for heaven's sakes. He did it with the Chinese communists more recently. He has been a surrender advocate, I'm afraid, at every turn. And it's one way of avoiding war, to surrender, but it's not a particularly satisfactory outcome. And what Ronald Reagan showed is that there's an alternative that actually can conduce to victory. That's what he did then. That's what the Committee on the Present Danger helped him do. And that's what we have to be about right now as well.
We got about a minute left in this segment. We're going to bring you back for the next one, but let's continue on. Is that what was it about the? I want to go to Graham Allison and Henry Kissinger in the 70s. This original, Thucydides trap 1.0. What did they argue at the time? They argued we were the declining power, they're the rising power, and what was their solution?
Well, as I said, I think, Steve, their solution was, let's just try to give the Soviets what they want. And it was not just political legitimacy. It was not just a dominant position in Europe. It was not just, most favored nation status, trade arrangements that would enrich and support their actually failing economy. It was also really an acceptance of our second-class status. And I think that was appalling to vast numbers of Americans when Ronald Reagan essentially took it to them in the 1980 election. They resonated powerfully to it. And it's what gives me, again, confidence that we can find in that same spirit American, first attitudes that we need for this time as well as we did back then.
Okay, our guest is Frank Gaffney. He's the co-founder of this new rejuvenated version of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. We're going to ask Frank to hang on. We're going to bring you back after the commercial break, and then we're going to bring in Brian Kennedy, his co-founder, Frank Gaffney. Special edition, War Room Pandemic. This is the Chinese Communist Party's war against America. We'll return in just a moment.
We might ask these guys, how did the Intel guys get it so wrong? And then
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
With now over 6.6 million downloads on the podcast, and this is besides the fact that we're distributed ubiquitously throughout the world, now with 100 million views. I want to thank the team over at G News and G Media that will subtitle this in Mandarin and blow through the firewall later today. These are 1-hour specials we're doing all week. We've got the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and we're going to drill down in depth on the economic war, the information war, how they've corrupted the American elite. We're going to finish up with their military capability. We start off the week with yesterday we had the geopolitical thinker Edward Luttwak. You can get that up online now. Had a tremendous downloads already with this. So we're really excited about these specials. Frank Gaffney and Brian Kennedy, the two gentlemen who took the initiative to restart the Committee on the Present Danger. Before we go to the threat vectors of the Chinese Communist Party today, I do want to go back to how we had victory. You were there, Frank. You saw it against all the conventional wisdom, which today we would say is the Morning Joe crowd of David Ignatius and Richard Haas and Admiral Stavridis and all these guys. Back in the mid-'70s, you could see a shift. I was a young naval officer, but you could see it, that the American people didn't want second-class status. The American people did not want to surrender to the communists. And you saw it throughout the world, right. And it was led. But walk us through how Reagan came up and how important the Committee on the Present Danger was back then to give an alternative about how to view the world. And it turned out the view of the world that was smart, although when the committee and all these things were first formed, they were mocked and ridiculed as Ronald Reagan was mocked and ridiculed.
Yeah. Steve, I think that the Committee on the Present Danger played an absolutely instrumental role because it not only was supporting one of its own members, Ronald Reagan, in the ways that I talked about, in terms of articulating for him how he could craft a strategy that would be the antithesis of détente and surrender, that it would reestablish American preeminence and help bring down Soviet communism. But it also took that very important message of opportunity and of necessity to the American people. It helped craft, I believe, that winning strategy and the mandate for it that was necessary when Ronald Reagan got into the clinches with Jimmy Carter and ultimately decisively defeated him. It was in part because the American people pulled in behind him. And one of the things that strategy was so clear-eyed about, and I was there on the military side in the Pentagon at the time, but one of our colleagues from whom we'll be hearing a little later in the week, Roger Robinson, was at the National Security Council and helping the president craft the economic warfare component of that strategy, which essentially went after the cash flow of the Soviet Union. And it turned out it wasn't this ultimately winning economic model. It was a house of cards. And when the cash flow dried up, it declared bankruptcy, and within hours, it was out of business as a political factor as well. This is a model for our time, I believe, and one we need to get about right quick, because as you say, the corruption of our elite, most especially the corruption on Wall Street, and I'm talking specifically about people like Larry Fink, the 800-ton gorilla with BlackRock, and Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone, and the Goldman Sachs gang, and JP Morgan and others who are making billions of dollars, for sure, propping up the Chinese communists in much the way that we, for a time, were propping up the Soviet Union, but with other people's money, namely ours. And we've had 134 individuals, and I was very pleased that you were among them, Steve, joined together to urge that the monies that are going into propping up the Chinese Communist Party and enabling its aggressiveness today not have, in addition, access to the retirement funds of America's fighting men and women and government employees of the civilian stripe, both active and retired, who are currently at the knife's edge of having their money, their life savings, going into companies that are involved, among other things, if you can believe it, in oppressing people in China, Uyghurs among others, with their social credit system, surveillance state apparatus, and engaged in proliferation. Some of these companies are sanctioned by the United States government. It's illegal to do business with them, and yet we're being told you can still invest in them. And not least, building weapon systems with which to kill our men and women in uniform, and the rest of us for that matter. This is not just wrong. This is not just crazy. This is actually obscene. But that corporate elite, that Wall Street crowd, the successors under Henry Kissinger's continuing influence, if you can believe it, are persisting in this same idea that if we just make China richer, it'll behave just fine. Or perhaps it's the rising power, we're the losing one, let's just get with the winning team. And that is, well, again, offensive, I think, to most Americans, and I believe particularly in the wake of this pandemic, and you've done such a fabulous job with War Room chronicling what's been done to us by the Chinese Communist Party that unleashed this on us. We are now at a point, Steve, where I think the American people, just as in 1980, on a different course. We've got polls that the Committee on the Present Danger China did. You can find them at presentdangerchina.org, by the way, along with a lot of other resources. There's a new Pew Research Center poll. This says 90% of the American people are now alarmed by China's power. This is the moment for a different course. This is the moment for the kind of, I believe, strategy that Donald Trump has articulated, but it needs to be faithfully executed, including by stopping this insane underwriting of the Chinese Communist Party and its global ambitions by American investors and institutions, including, God forbid, the thrift savings plan of the United States government.
Frank, this is Jack Max. I wanted to ask you a quick question about when we watched the Soviet Union collapse. One of the things that always struck me through the 70s and the 80s, especially when we looked at it retrospectively, was just how badly our intelligence services had called their economic strength, called their military strength. Are we in some way potentially making the same mistakes here with China?
I think so. You know, what's happened to us in recent years is similar to what was done by Stansfield Turner, you may remember, was Jimmy Carter's director of Central Intelligence. And that is, under John Brennan, we basically went out of the human intelligence business. We largely came to rely, as with Stansfield Turner, on our sophisticated technical means. But they're not really all that good at penetrating a lot of closely held secrets of states or, for that matter, terrorist organizations. But without the human intelligence that we need, I think we've relied to a considerable and crazy degree on so-called foreign liaison services to provide us assistance. Well, you rely on foreign governments' intelligence to do the collection for you, and you're going to get basically what they want you to have. And an awful lot of people are of a mind with the group that I was just talking about, that, hey, the United States is basically toast. China is the rising power. Let's get with the winners. And I think that has contributed, you're absolutely right, Jack, to inadequate understanding of both China's growing strengths, which are very worrying, and also their vulnerabilities, which we must exploit.
I want to take you back in history, because this is very important for the American people to understand. Is that first off, when President Reagan made this pivot and started to engage and really take on the evil empire with a "we win, they lose," he was vilified. People think that the stuff around Trump is tough. You had millions of people in Central Park in New York City protesting the Pershing missiles in Western Europe, in London, in Paris. These places were shut down because of these demonstrations. President Reagan was dogged every day of being a warmonger. But one of the things, the most important thing he did is when he got there, I think it was Andy Marshall at the Net Assessment Group and Bill Casey, who a Wall Street deal guy who took over the CIA. They did a fundamental, at his direction, a reassessment of the Soviet Union. They came back with a, hey, oops, CIA, DIA, all the intelligence guys missed it. This economy's only half as big as we thought it was, right? Which meant that 50 cents of every dollar was going to middle. That was huge. And Reagan goes, well, how big are they? And they go, well, smaller than California. He goes, hey, I understand they get nuclear weapons. Why are we afraid of these guys? They're tiny. It's what Russia is today. But it's to your point, the CCP and what they've done, this is a house of cards, propped up by the financiers in the City of London and in Wall Street and the corporatists. So, Frank, you got about 2 minutes left. How do you, given all those threat vectors, the Committee on the Present Danger, what is your line of work here to take on and take down the Chinese Communist Party?
Steve, we're going to be talking more with your help over the next couple of days about those threat vectors, and I think this is really important because people need to understand. The short answer is, I think the single most important thing we can do, and that the Committee on the Present Danger China has been focused on like a laser beam, is to stop enabling these various threats. The Chinese unleashed this pandemic upon us deliberately. I think Tom Cotton is absolutely right in saying it, malevolently, but they did it as part of a much larger strategy of destroying us through non-kinetic means if they can. We need to be fighting back now to the extent we can, and I believe it's considerable, through non-kinetic means as well. If we simply go after their cash flow, Steve, all these problems become a lot more tractable. They don't have the walking around money. They don't have the money to invest in their companies. They don't have the money to build those weapons.
We got a minute left. Why do you agree with what? Hang on. Why do you agree? Got a minute left. Why do you agree with Tom Cotton that they did this malevolently? What leads you to that? That's a pretty. Then you've kind of crossed a line there. Why do you think that?
Well, let me say what he said to Maria Bartiromo yesterday on Fox News. He said, when they figured out the true nature of this disease and what it was going to do to them, they intentionally ensured that it would move around the world so that it afflicted everybody. They would not be particularly disadvantaged. In fact, they might find ways to benefit from it. This is what we're up against. This is a war crime of epic proportions, in my estimation. I think it is an act of war, a crime against humanity at the very least. And Steve, they need to be held accountable for it. And one of the ways that we can do that is by harnessing the horror, the anger, the frustration of the American people and enabling them to act as Ronald Reagan did decades ago, to stop supporting and enabling our enemy. Stop funding our enemy first and foremost, and start putting America first again.
In 30 seconds, if we don't confront this now, if we don't have the courage to confront it like Reagan and these people confronted it in 1980, if we don't confront it, what's the future of America like?
Well, I think this is our last chance, quite honestly. I think the Chinese communists are working assiduously at taking us down piece by piece. It means the end of freedom. And unfortunately, that's not just for other people around the world that they're working to enslave through their Belt and Road Initiative and the like. It means for us as well. And we're seeing a lot of it in part enabled by enemies within, and I think they need to be called out and countered as well. but they're also doing it through all of their state organizations and apparatuses, and we'll be talking a lot more about that in the coming days. Thanks to you.
Frank Gaffney, you're a great patriot and a great man. Thank you very much for joining us here on War and Pandemic Special Edition.
Thank you, Steve.
The Committee on the Present Danger, China confronts the Chinese Communist Party. We'll return with the other co-founder, Brian Kennedy, in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
The Committee on the Present Danger, China. It's a rejuvenated Committee on the Present Danger to face the enemy we have today, the Chinese Communist Party, a very sophisticated group of gangsters out of Beijing. Brian Kennedy's right. These guys are absolutely the most sophisticated in the world in information warfare, economic warfare. They understand capital markets, and they understand the United States of America. They understand how our elites roll. They understand the power structure of this country, and they're deeply embedded. Brian, are we in – just had Frank on talking about the Cold War and the committee back in the 70s, 80s, President Reagan's we win, they lose, an ultimate victory over the evil empire. But let's go back in time to the mid-century, the 20th century. Are we in 1938 when we look at the Hitler and the rise of the Nazis? Are we in 38, or is General Spaulding, the great author of Stealth War, blew me up on the show the other day, said, Bannon, you're wrong. We're in 1944 and we're not winning. Are we in 38? Or are we in 1944?
Well, I would argue 38, Steve, that we haven't exactly fought this war yet. Most Americans won't even know that China is a threat. They won't know that we've been in this economic and political war. Whereas if you actually told them what China was doing, they actually can see what China has done here with the Wuhan virus, CCP virus, I know you like to call it. When people actually see that, they will become motivated. They're getting motivated. Both the survey that the committee did and the recent Pew survey of public opinion show that the American people believe China's a threat, they're a danger to them, and that when these American people wake up to all that, they're going to demand that their political officials are going to go do the right thing. That I'm more than confident of, and that's one reason to think this is 1938. And the other is we're Americans. We don't just, we don't think we're going to lose something or that we have lost something. We figure out ways of rallying the American people to go do the right thing.
Tom Cotton yesterday talking about a guy that's woke. On Maria Bartiromo on Fox News yesterday, He said, hey, look, let's be brutally frank. When they found out, forget the fact that it come a lab or anything like that, but when they found out they had a problem, they essentially weaponized it for the world. They hid it, they lied about it, and they just let it go around the world, which would lead you to believe that's not just a crime against humanity. That may actually be an act of war. What say you?
Well, actually, I have a new piece up at the AmericanMind.org for the Claremont Institute, where I make the case that it may not have started out as a weapon of mass destruction, but it certainly ended up as one. I think the PRC believed if they were going to suffer this virus, so too was the rest of the world. Senator Cotton made a very similar argument. And the mere fact that the Chinese are in an economic war with America and with President Trump specifically seems to me a great incentive to have spread this virus around the world. If you're the PRC, do you have any interest in the American people on lockdown, having the greatest economy in the world shut down, the people who voted for President Trump, the deplorables, at home, unemployed, disaffected from their leader, President Trump, who they can no longer see at rallies, having to listen to these doctors, 24/7 in the media talking about how deadly the virus is and how we're going to have to stay indoors forever. If you're the PRC or the Communist Party, do you have any interest in us being under that kind of lockdown? There is, of course, the economic devastation we're doing to the country, but there's also the political and social damage we're doing to the country, and that is enormous. And so if you were the Chinese, could you have figured out that this was a worthwhile strategy to test against the American people. They might not have known if it was going to work, but look at what we're going through today, and you guys have been brilliant on your show for the last couple months, just describing that for everybody.
Look, you're a busy guy, and you're an American patriot. For you to take the time and really put your shoulder to the wheel in a voluntary effort to get this committee stood back up and focus, given that fact pattern, given your new article in the American Mind, given your direction, where do you see the committee and where do you sense to drive it? We got about 2 or 3 minutes left over the next days, weeks, and months ahead to take a torch to the enemy.
Well, that's a great question, too. The main thing is for the American people to understand just what's at stake. I think right now they are deeply confused. Their president, Donald Trump, has shut the country down. They're not sure exactly why. They're told the virus is deadly, and I do believe it is deadly, but they're not quite certain when it's going to open. You have doctors saying this and that, and one day it's serious, one day it's less serious, and so there's confusion. The committee's job is really to remind people of where this virus came from. And if the Chinese Communist Party was willing to do that to its own people and to the world in such a brazen way, you see something about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, that ultimately they want to reorder the world to their liking. And the American people need to understand that this is a dangerous world, that they ought to be supporting a much more aggressive buildup of the American military, much more serious economic policies, holding the Chinese to account when it comes to this spread of this virus, the damage it's done to the United States, and to realize, without being at all provocative, we are at war, and it's irresponsible to think otherwise, that this was not an accident. This was something they did intentionally to spread it around the world. They let flights go from Wuhan to the rest of the world. So even if it didn't start out as a bioweapon attack, it has certainly ended up as one. We see the devastation it's done to the United States, and the American people have to prepare themselves in the future. And the committee's job is to help explain that to them with the best voices in the country in as sober a way as possible, not to be warmongers. That's not our interest. It's for the American people to be serious again. Imagine, again, this was 1938. You'd be telling people what Hitler was doing. You don't have to mischaracterize him. You don't have to try to scare them. They've been scared enough. But you need to be sober with the American people, just how dangerous all this is.
Brian, how can people get more access to your Twitter account, and how do they get to your writings?
First of all, I go to presentdangerchina.org for the committee, and there's a link for me up on that site. And my Twitter handle is Britrav, B-R-I-T-R-A-V, Kennedy. Britrav Kennedy.
We'll get this all up on our site. Thank you very much. Great American patriot, Brian Kennedy, now the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger. We'll be back tomorrow.